Let's start tonight's adventure with a universal human obsession. Sleep, not the Instagrammable, memory foam, blackout curtain variety, but the gritty, drafty, and suspiciously itchy reality of medieval slumber. Before you try to get too cozy, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you're as fascinated by history's weird side as I am, and subscribe for more time-traveling tales. While you're here, drop into the comments to tell me where you're watching from, and, bonus points, what time it is. There's something magical about knowing someone in Tokyo is settling in for breakfast, while someone else in Toronto is fighting off sleep just to listen to stories about peasants and featherbeds. Alright, set the mood, dim the lights, grab a blanket, and maybe bring your emotional support goat, because we're about to slip into the nighttime world of the Middle Ages, a place where sleep was less a gentle drift and more a tactical maneuver. If you think your sleep schedule is weird, let me introduce you to medieval segmented sleep. Imagine splitting your night in half like a loaf of bread that's already gone stale. The nightly routine was as follows. After sunset, everyone would trundle off to bed, collapsing into what they called first sleep. Sounds fancy, right? But after 4 hours or so, the real party started. People would wake up, not because they were plagued by existential dread or scrolling through TikTok, but because this was simply how their internal clocks, unbothered by LEDs or midnight emails, were wired. This wasn't considered insomnia, it was the gold standard. During this mystical interlude, the medieval multitaskers would tend the fire, say prayers, check on their livestock, which was always a thrill, because nothing quite matches the suspense of wondering if your goat is plotting an escape at 2 in the morning, or maybe sneak in a bit of private conversation that couldn't happen while the kids were snoring. And yes, this break between sleeps was also prime time for marital intimacy. Medieval marriage manuals and physicians wrote approvingly about this window. The body, they said, was rested and the mind peaceful, which is medieval code for don't start an argument. If you think waking up early to make coffee is romantic, just remember your ancestors were awake at midnight tending fires and keeping the family line going. Once the watch was over, everyone settled back in for second sleep, lasting until sunrise. This wasn't just a peasant thing. Monks, nobles, and literary types like Chaucer all followed the same rhythm. Even medieval poetry complains about not sleeping through the night, which proves that insomnia is as old as time. But at least back then it was trendy. Oddly enough, modern researchers discovered that this 2-stage sleep cycle is actually pretty natural for humans. Without artificial lights to mess with our circadian rhythms, our bodies naturally want to rest, wake, and then rest again. So if you're wide awake at 2 a.m., just tell yourself you're living your best medieval life. Go check on your metaphorical goats, or at least your phone charger. This segmented sleep system reigned supreme until the Industrial Revolution barged in with its gas lamps, factories, and obsession with productivity. Suddenly, everyone was expected to log a rigid 8 hours, as if sleep were an Olympic event. But back in the medieval world, waking up at midnight wasn't a failure. It was life. Everyone did it, and if you didn't, well, you probably had something more pressing to worry about, like the state of your mattress. And that brings us to the medieval bed, if we can call it that. In our world, we'll argue for hours about the merits of memory foam, cooling gels, and thread counts. In medieval Europe, a bed was simply a pile of whatever you could gather that wasn't actively trying to bite you. The standard peasant bed was a pallet, a sack of rough cloth stuffed with straw or hay, if you had a sack at all. Otherwise, it was just straw on the floor, which might double as a cat's personal kingdom. These beds weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for not dying of exposure. Straw was great for insulation, but it was also the 5-star resort for lice, fleas, and the occasional mouse. Sleeping was an exercise in stillness and optimism. If it itched, you ignored it. If something bit you, you rolled over and hoped it was small. For the lucky few with extra coins, or a back that demanded mercy, these straw sacks could be hoisted onto a wooden frame, which helped keep you off the damp floor and slightly out of reach of beetles. It didn't transform the sleep experience, but it was a minor upgrade, like going from economy to economy plus. Linens were rare, Most people wore the same clothes to bed that they'd worn all day. Pajamas? Forget it. And don't even dream about personal space. Families, parents, children, a passing elderly relative, slept together, often on the same pallet. If you got chilly, just roll into your sibling's ribs. If the dog joined, well, congratulations, you had central heating. Now, for the upper crust. Nobles enjoyed what could generously be called real beds. These were large, wooden, often ornately carved frames, topped with feather mattresses, covered in embroidered sheets, and crowned with canopies to keep out drafts and, with any luck, the lice. These beds were so valuable that they were mentioned in wills. You didn't inherit a castle. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. There's nothing like the joy of family heirlooms filled with generations of mysterious lumps. Still, even in manners, beds were less about luxury and more about survival. The real dream was not waking up with a goose feather stuck to your cheek or a chicken under your pillow. And then there's the nightcap, a concept that's undergone a complete makeover since the Middle Ages. Today, it's a cozy drink to send you off to dreamland. Back then, the nightcap was a literal hat, and not a subtle one. It was designed to keep your head attached to your body temperature during the kind of cold that seeps through stone walls and laughs at your attempts to block drafts with animal skins. Medieval architecture was a triumph of looks pretty, feels like a meat locker. Windows were made from animal horn or oiled parchment, which is to say, they stopped precisely zero cold air. So you wore a hat to bed, and the hat came in all flavors. Pointed, droopy, sometimes looking like it belonged to a wizard who moonlighted as a stable boy. These hats were usually wool or linen, and if you could spare the fabric without risking a goat uprising, you might even embellish it. For men, it was pure practicality. For women, it doubled as a coif or head wrap to keep modesty intact and hide hair that hadn't been introduced to soap since the last festival. And then there was the matter of status. In some places, married women had to cover their heads at all times. Yes, even in bed. The nightcap could be embroidered or dyed to show off a bit of wealth, because nothing says "I've made it" like a miniature flag on your scalp. In town, seeing someone in a nightcap at the door was the medieval equivalent of a "Do Not Disturb" sign. If you knocked and someone answered in their hat, you'd know to come back tomorrow. And of course, these hats paired perfectly with the medieval nightshirt, a long, loose tunic that would make Ebenezer Scrooge proud. Minus the ghostly interventions, sleepwear was practical, itchy, and occasionally flammable. Perfect for a night spent trying not to roll into the fireplace. Now, let's talk about sleeping with strangers. Not the swipe right kind, but the good old-fashioned medieval inn experience. Imagine you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose donkey has thrown in the towel halfway to York. You find an inn, which is already a stroke of luck, but instead of a private room, you get a space in a bed that's already half occupied by a couple of strangers. Inns in the Middle Ages were glorified bunkhouses. Privacy was a myth. If there was bed space, you were sharing it, no questions asked. Your bedmates might snore, talk in their sleep, or display a collection of boils worthy of a medieval medical treatise. This wasn't rude, it was efficient. Beds could fit 2, 3, or more travelers depending on how well everyone could tolerate elbows and questionable hygiene. In busier towns, you might find yourself in a dormitory with rows of beds, each one a battleground for blankets and prime real estate. Snoring was unregulated. Elbow jabs were part of the deal. Sometimes inns separated guests by gender or profession. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, and in theory thieves with other thieves. Though I suspect that last one was wishful thinking. Most of the time it was first come, first sprawled. Germaphobes. Look away. This was an upgrade from sleeping outside with wolves, mud, and the occasional peasant rebellion. If you worried about theft, you were not alone. Medieval travelers often slept with their purses tied to their belts or stuffed under their tunics. Others used their travel bundles as both pillow and security alarm system. If your bag shifted in the night, it probably meant a lighter wallet by morning. The wealthy, of course, didn't have to endure this social experiment. Nobles travelled with entourages and expected private accommodations, or at least a bed that hadn't just been vacated by a plague victim. If the innkeeper knew what was good for business, they'd make it happen. Bedtime in the Middle Ages wasn't just about collapsing onto whatever passed for a mattress. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes were your immortal soul. People approached sleep with the same level of caution as someone about to click a suspicious email link. You didn't just hit the hay, you prepared to potentially meet your maker. Cue the bedtime prayers. Forget lavender spray or mindfulness podcasts. The medieval wind-down routine included confessions, psalms, and soul-cleansing spiritual clauses, just in case you died somewhere between good night and good morning. The logic was simple. Death could strike at any moment, whether via illness, fire, demons, or the always lethal milestone of turning 35 in 1273. So you prayed not for peace, but for last-minute redemption. One classic prayer: if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Sounds sweet until you realize it's basically a will written by a nervous 7-year-old. Adults had a full suite of prayers for every threat: guilt, devils lurking in the rafters, or the ever-present spectre of plague, which, let's face it, had a disappointing track record. Some prayed to saints known for protecting sleepers, essentially holy bouncers for the soul. The really devout monks, nuns, and nobles with anxiety ended their nights with compline, the final prayer service before bed, followed by a vow of silence. This was not a challenge, since most people were already exhausted, underfed, and mildly terrified of the dark. Children were drafted into the prayer army too. It was good for their souls and kept them from questioning why the family goat was once again in the bed. Parents would remind them that angels were always watching, which sounds lovely until you realize it was more like a medieval version of security cameras than a guardian angel. Bedtime prayer was less about inner peace and more about cosmic insurance. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of running antivirus software before shutting down for the night. You hoped it worked, even if you weren't entirely sure how. So if your bedtime routine involves 5 pillows, a playlist of soothing rain sounds, and a panic scroll through your phone, take heart. Your medieval counterparts navigated a world of straw mattresses, nightcaps, and the real possibility of waking up next to a goat or a neighbor's unwashed feet. And as we drift from the world of beds and bedtime chaos, we'll dive even deeper into the mysteries of medieval sleep. Because once the candles are out and the prayers have been said, dreams and sleep companions take center stage. And trust me, things only get weirder from here. In the modern world, dreams are usually dismissed as random nonsense. Today we tend to treat dreams like the spam folder of the mind. Random, sometimes embarrassing, and usually best forgotten by breakfast. Unless you're the sort who Googles, what does it mean if I dreamt about my boss riding a unicycle? But in the medieval world, dreams weren't just weird nighttime entertainment, or the result of too much goat cheese. Dreams had eternal significance. They were a kind of divine WhatsApp, with messages coming from God, angels, saints, or, on a bad night, from the devil himself. You never knew if your dream was a gentle nudge from your guardian angel, a dire warning from a saint, or a prank from some demon with too much time on its hands. And if you happen to dream about a relic you kissed at church last Sunday, you might want to inform your local priest just in case. Medieval people took dream interpretation as seriously as we take hacking a Wi-Fi password. Whole books were devoted to decoding the hidden meanings of dreams. Picture the scene. A monk sits hunched over parchment by candlelight, cataloguing what it might mean if you dreamt of fire, which probably signified hell, or water, which could mean purification, or, just as easily, drowning. It was really a gamble. Now if you dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish, that was the medieval equivalent of a system error. Call a priest, pack your bags, and maybe consider a career change. The stakes were high, because it was believed your soul was still wandering around while your body slept. This meant that whatever you did in a dream, yes, even that embarrassing bit where you stole a loaf of bread or argued with an unusually well-spoken chicken, could be a spiritual confession. Maybe your subconscious was revealing your guilt for gluttony, or maybe you were just hungry after a meager dinner. Either way, best to be safe and confess it. Monks and nuns would dutifully record their dreams, reporting visions to their spiritual superiors. Some were celebrated for having holy dreams, while others were quietly advised to cut down on onions before bedtime. Dreams weren't just for theologians and the sleep-deprived. They were the medieval Netflix, packed with angels, demons, and allegorical creatures who loved to recite poetry about virtue. Only, instead of binge-watching, you might wake up and have to fast for 3 days, or write a lengthy confession. The church, never one to let people have too much fun, was deeply suspicious of dreams. Not every dream was a message from above. Sometimes it was a demonic plot to corrupt your soul, or simply the result of inhaling too much fireplace smoke. If your dreams took a turn for the dark or unwholesome, you might be accused of spiritual weakness, or just sleeping too close to the embers again. Now, let's talk about bed companions. These days, letting your dog sleep on the bed is a lifestyle choice, one that results in muddy paw prints and waking up with a tail in your face. But back in the Middle Ages, sharing a bed with an animal was less about bonding and more about not freezing to death. Medieval homes made modern camping seem luxurious. Picture stone walls, zero insulation, and drafts so persistent you'd swear they had personalities. Forget central heating. The family pig was your radiator. In peasant homes, humans and livestock often bunked together in the same room, sometimes even the same bed, but more often a communal straw heap. Chickens wandered the floor like feathery roommates with no regard for bedtime. Dogs curled up near your feet. Pigs snorted contentedly near the hearth. And if you got through the night without being bitten, you counted yourself fortunate. This wasn't just affection. Though a warm dog is a blessing in any era, it was a matter of survival. Every animal was a little space heater with hooves or fur. A big dog might keep your toes from turning blue, while a cow in the corner could nudge the temperature up just enough to keep the frost at bay. In the dead of winter, 1 degree could feel like a miracle. Life for peasants was a lesson in togetherness. The whole family, including animals, ate, cooked, slept, and occasionally argued in the same room. Kids might find themselves sandwiched between parents and a goat. Chickens might serve as alarm clocks, pecking around when the sun came up. As for hygiene, well, let's just say that medieval people were tough, adaptable, and maybe a little less squeamish than we are today. If you're picturing a cozy scene, remember, fleas and lice were the real bedfellows, and nobody was immune. For the wealthy, animal roommates were less about warmth and more about status. Nobles rarely slept next to livestock, but they might have a pampered lapdog in bed, more for fashion than function, and certainly good for redistributing fleas. Some castles even provided special sleeping quarters for favored animals, because nothing says I'm important quite like your dog having its own chamber. Still, even the grandest noble couldn't escape the occasional bark, snore, or mysterious scratching in the night. Animals, of course, are not known for respecting personal space or bedtime etiquette. A hoof in your face at 3 a.m, just another Tuesday. If you've ever shared a dorm room or survived a family road trip, you have a faint idea of what medieval sleeping arrangements felt like, except with more barnyard odors and fewer complaints to hotel management. Now, if you thought sharing a bed with a pig was rough, allow me to introduce you to the medieval monastery, where comfort went to die quietly behind stone walls. Monastic dormitories were the ultimate test of endurance. Picture dozens of monks all sleeping in a single cavernous room arranged in tidy rows, like saintly sardines. Beds, if you want to be generous with the term, were usually wooden planks, sometimes topped with straw if the abbot was feeling merciful, or if it was a feast day. Sleeping in your clothes wasn't a quirky habit, but a necessity. Getting up for prayers in the middle of the night was hard enough without fumbling around in the dark trying to find your robe. The monastic uniform, robe, belt, and sandals doubled as both spiritual armor and a flimsy defense against the cold. Pillows were a luxury, privacy was unheard of, and silence was strictly enforced. If you so much as muttered in your sleep, you might find yourself scrubbing chamber pots for a week. Snoring was a grey area. You couldn't help it, but if you became too disruptive, your brothers might nudge you awake with suspicious frequency, and you might find yourself repenting noisily at morning prayers. Light was kept to a minimum. Maybe one flickering candle for the entire dormitory. You didn't need to see your cellmates. You just needed to lie still, stay quiet, and most importantly avoid sinning in your sleep. This was serious business. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed silence, discipline, and austerity. Sleep wasn't an indulgence, it was a necessity, carefully monitored and scheduled. Some monks, determined to deny themselves even the smallest comfort, would sleep sitting upright, just enough to prevent dreaming, relaxation, or decent circulation. Compared to this, a straw pile with a snoring pig starts to sound downright luxurious. At least the pig didn't judge you. That brings us to the real heart of medieval sleep. It was less about comfort and more about survival, spiritual and physical. Whether you were decoding dream omens, dodging a restless cow, or lining up your sandals for the midnight prayer bell, every night was a test of resilience. And just when you think it couldn't get any stranger, imagine having to sleep upright in the same room as everyone else, waging nightly battles with an army of pests. This next part would horrify most modern sleepers. Let's slide under the itchy woolen covers of medieval sleep, where the concept of personal space was about as real as Wi-Fi. Picture this, the still dark hours of night, the stone walls of a monastery radiating the kind of chill that turns your breath into little clouds. For monks and nuns, the night was not a time for undisturbed rest, but for a schedule so strict, it would make even the most disciplined gym bro cry. The canonical hours ruled their lives, and smack in the middle of the night came matins, the first service of the day, except this day began long before sunrise. The bell would clang through the dormitory, rung by the unlucky soul on duty, and suddenly a line of groggy robe-clad figures would shuffle off in silence, the only layering they cared about being spiritual, not thermal. Pajamas, not a thing. Everyone wore their habits, layered up for modesty, and maybe a little extra warmth, but mostly because solid sleepwear innovation hadn't yet arrived. Inside the chapel, candlelight flickered against cold stone, and the air was thick with the scent of melted wax and tired devotion. Under the echoing arches, monks would chant psalms and recite scripture, all while fighting off the urge to nod off. Falling asleep during prayers wasn't just embarrassing, it could earn you a special reward, like even more prayers or a bonus chore. You dozed off in matins? Congratulations, you're leading the next one. Some orders stretched matins into 2-hour marathons, which meant more time for spiritual reflection and existential hunger pangs, since dinner had been little more than a sermon disguised as a bowl of lentils. Occasionally after matins there was a chance for a second round of sleep, but in stricter orders the night simply rolled straight into study or work, because nothing says holy discipline like threshing wheat on 4 hours of broken rest. Why such self-inflicted sleep deprivation? It was all about sacrificing comfort and giving the quietest part of the night to God, away from the temptations of daylight and, more importantly, REM cycles. The theory was noble. The reality involved numb feet, fidgeting in the pews, and Brother Ambrose's enthusiastic but tragically off-key singing, echoing off the vaults. In today's world, sleeping alone is practically a badge of honor. You've got your own bed, your own blanket, and if you're lucky, a room that doesn't double as a barn. But in the medieval world, the idea of solitary slumber was suspicious, impractical, or downright unwise. Let's break it down. First, there was warmth, or, more accurately, the desperate pursuit of it. Medieval beds weren't cozy. Stone walls and drafty chimneys made sure of that. With central heating still centuries and several plagues away, people shared beds not out of affection, but out of sheer necessity. Children bundled together with siblings and parents. Sometimes, if the neighbor's child was visiting, they'd get tossed into the pile too. It was like a sleepover, except nobody got to vote on who attended. But beyond the need for warmth, there was a spiritual logic to communal sleep. The night was considered the devil's favorite playground. Alone in the dark, your soul was more vulnerable to temptation, or, worse, possession. Sleeping in the company of others created a sort of moral firewall. If something supernatural happened, at least you had witnesses, or maybe just someone to blame if the demon picked the wrong bed. For children, the idea of sleeping alone was unthinkable. Bedtime stories back then weren't about cuddly bears. They were cautionary tales starring ghosts, fairies and spirits that could snatch you away for daring to close your eyes in solitude. Solitary sleep was painted as a gateway to disaster, and these tales didn't end with hugs. They ended with vanishings. Even married couples often found themselves sharing the bed with children, servants, or the occasional guest. Privacy was less a right and more an unproven rumor. In fact, a giant bed occupied by only 2 people would have seemed not just wasteful, but deeply suspicious. Was something amiss in that household? In monasteries, communal sleeping was the rule, not the exception. And if you were ever assigned to sleep alone, it was likely a punishment. That's right, solitary sleep as a disciplinary measure. Medieval logic insisted that being alone at night opened the door to sin, while group sleep meant accountability. So next time you're sprawled across your memory foam mattress, cocooned in your own blanket, savor the silence in the absence of barnyard scents. In medieval times, you'd be sharing your bed with 2 children, a sheepdog, and maybe a cousin, all snoring and none of them optional. If you've ever dozed off upright in a boring lecture or on public transport, you know the kind of regret that comes with waking up with a stiff neck. In the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't just a bad habit, it was a lifestyle choice, especially among the wealthy or the particularly pious. But why would anyone voluntarily prop themselves up to sleep? The reasons ranged from the medically questionable to the spiritually creative. Physicians of the era believed that lying flat was a health hazard. It was thought to mess with digestion, disrupt the lungs, or upset the delicate balance of bodily humors, a favorite medieval catch-all. The logic was that upright sleeping prevented congestion of the brain, which sounds ominous, but mostly meant don't drown in your own phlegm. Then there were the spiritual concerns. Lying flat was considered dangerously similar to the posture of the dead. You didn't want to accidentally signal to God or the local reaper that you were ready for your final exit just by catching some Zeds. Superstition was strong, and when your priest doubled as the village health advisor, you learned to pick your battles. As a result, people often slept propped up with oversized pillows, bolsters, or the medieval equivalent of a recliner, a headboard angled just right for digestion, and apparently fending off surprise demonic attacks. Nobles had beds designed for partial reclining, perfect for digesting last night's meat pie, or keeping one wary eye on the shadowy corners of the room. Monks, of course, took it up a notch. In stricter orders, they might sleep sitting upright on a bench, or leaning against a cold stone wall, with only a hood for comfort. It wasn't about rest, it was about discipline. Too much comfort led to dreams, dreams led to sinful thoughts, and sinful thoughts led straight to confession at dawn. So medieval sleep was not about waking up refreshed, it was about virtue, endurance, and a touch of confusing theology. Move over haunted dreams and goblins under the bed. For the people of the Middle Ages, the real midnight monsters were very much alive, extremely persistent, and completely indifferent to your prayers. I'm talking about fleas, lice, and the unofficial mascot of the medieval bedroom, the bedbug. Let's not romanticize it. Medieval hygiene was, to put it kindly, a work in progress. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive, and soap was sometimes made from substances that would make you reconsider the whole concept of cleanliness. Add in straw-stuffed mattresses, communal bedding, and the occasional live chicken wandering beneath the bed, and you had a paradise for pests. Fleas and lice weren't occasional visitors, they were daily companions. Peasants, nobles, it didn't matter. Even the fanciest featherbed couldn't keep pests at bay. Some wealthy households even had dedicated nitpickers, actual servants whose job was to rid their employer's hair and clothing of lice. Imagine introducing yourself. Hi, I'm the Royal Scalp Specialist. Bedbugs, on the other hand, were the silent assassins of medieval sleep. They hid in the cracks of wooden bed frames, in the seams of mattresses, and even in the stone walls, waiting for nightfall to emerge and feast like tiny vampires. Ever wonder why medieval people wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed? It wasn't always about warmth. Sometimes it was self-defense against the relentless army of pests. Solutions to these nightly invasions ranged from mildly effective to downright bizarre. Some households burned pungent herbs like wormwood or tansy, hoping the smell would drive bugs away. Others opted for more creative approaches, sleeping with garlic, onions, or even ashes in the bed. It may not have deterred the bugs, but it certainly discouraged any late-night romance. The psychological discomfort was just as real as the physical one. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin or impurity, a living reminder of humanity's fall from grace and questionable choices in bedding materials. Entire poems were written about fleas, some moralizing, some weirdly romantic, because nothing says I love you like being bitten by the same flea. So while today's sleep gets interrupted by buzzing phones or streetlights, medieval sleep was more likely to be disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the unmistakable sensation that something was crawling up your shin. Spoiler alert, it probably was. We've all had nights where sleep feels impossible. But have you ever tried to drift off while wrapped in 100 pounds of iron? In the Middle Ages, some people did just that, because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like being ready to joust at a moment's notice. Now to be fair, even knights weren't sleeping in full armor every night. It was hot, clunky, and about as comfortable as napping inside a silverware drawer. But during war, or when danger loomed, sleeping partially armored was standard. Comfort was optional. Survival was mandatory. A knight on campaign might only remove his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his chainmail or breastplate on, just in case enemies decided to throw a surprise party before dawn. There's nothing quite like waking up to the sound of distant hooves and realizing you're still half dreaming about turnips. In besieged castles, men-at-arms might sleep with swords or axes within arm's reach. Think of it as an aggressive bedtime security system. Shields became makeshift pillows, and if the enemy breached the walls, at least you wouldn't have to scramble to get dressed. Priorities, medieval style. Of course, sleeping in armor wasn't exactly restful. Iron doesn't breathe, chainmail pinches, and the cold stone floor offers all the comfort of an airport terminal at midnight. Factor in the ambient snoring, the crackling torches, and the occasional rodent scurrying by, and you have a sleep environment that would make even the most desperate insomniac reconsider their bedtime routine. Even those not directly involved in battle sometimes slept in lighter protective gear. Traveling merchants or guards might nap in thick quilted gambesons, which offered a bit of padding and, if nothing else, some moral support. And let's not forget, armor is hardly subtle. Roll over the wrong way, and you might clang so loudly that everyone else wakes up, convinced the apocalypse has just kicked off again. So the next time you tuck yourself in, free from lice, fully horizontal, and blissfully alone, give a little nod to the medieval sleepers, huddled, upright, armored, and valiantly battling the endless parade of nighttime pests. But just when you think you've heard it all, medieval nights had even more surprises in store. Because in a world where nightly demons, lice infestations, and pigs in your bed weren't considered unusual, sleepwalking was just another inconvenience waiting to shuffle through the darkness. But let's dive deeper into that world, where lice were as common as socks, pigs sometimes shared your blankets, and demons were on the night shift. You might expect that sleepwalking would just blend into the medieval background noise of discomfort, but trust me, it was a headline act in the local rumour mill. In the Middle Ages, if you found yourself wandering around in your sleep, people didn't chalk it up to work stress, too much cheese, or binge-watching candlelight puppet shows. No, the medieval mind went straight to the supernatural, possession, sorcery, or maybe a bit of unfinished business with the nearest saint, sleepwalking. Or, if you wanted to sound like you'd read the fanciest Latin texts, noctambulation wasn't just a quirky sleep disorder. It was high drama with a dash of terror. Picture this, you're dozing on a straw mattress, only to see your neighbour gliding through the moonlit room. He's in a shapeless nightshirt, eyes rolled back, candle flickering, muttering Latin phrases he definitely never learned in school, and stepping right over a snoring pig. Most people didn't think, oh, he's just sleepwalking. They thought, is that a ghost, a heretic, or both at once? And depending on how suspicious your priest was, you might have an exorcism scheduled before your morning porridge. Some folks blamed sleepwalking on an excess of black bile, which, in medieval medicine, was basically the diagnosis for anything mysterious or inconvenient. Others were convinced that when you slept, your soul occasionally took a night out, leaving your body to stumble around like a confused chicken. The solutions people invented to stop these nightly adventures were a masterclass in medieval creativity, herbal concoctions, muttered prayers, iron charms dangling above the bed. If you could dream it, someone tried it. In especially nervous households, they'd just tie the offender's leg to a heavy chair, which, given the medieval home's design choices, was not the worst idea. Imagine open hearths, sharp knives left out, and a chamber pot lurking in the shadows, ready to turn a midnight stroll into a slapstick disaster. There were even stories, possibly exaggerated, but you never know, about people scaling rooftops in their sleep. The mere rumor of a sleepwalker tumbling from a thatched roof spurred villagers to bar their windows, and theologians to argue whether you could accidentally sin while unconscious. Most of the time, though, sleepwalkers just shuffled around, muttered nonsense, or tried to unlock doors that didn't exist. But if someone managed to drift into a church, the whole village might treat it as a message from above, or just break out the holy water for safety's sake. Now, living in the medieval world meant you had to be a champion at sleeping through pandemonium, church bells, thunderstorms, livestock arguing at midnight. These were just part of the soundtrack. For the sleep-starved medieval European, chaos was almost soothing. Let's talk about those bells. Church bells were the original alarm clocks, ringing to announce sunrise, prayer, meals, or the dreaded matins. Yes, that's the one that goes off at 2 or 3 in the morning. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams came with a free percussion section. Eventually, your brain just accepted it and called it a lullaby. But bells weren't the only thing shaking up your REM cycle. Storms in the medieval era were a full-body experience. No weather forecasts, no double glazing. You felt every thunderclap, draft and leaky roof, as if the world might actually end. Chimneys shrieked, windows rattled, and the rain did its best to join you in bed. People still managed to fall asleep though, because life didn't pause for a little insomnia. The next day demanded ploughing, praying, and if you were really unlucky, running away from Viking raiders. Even when disaster struck, famine, war, the infamous Black Death, people somehow kept sleeping. Death carts rattling down the street at dawn were less a panic trigger and more of a grim medieval alarm clock. And if you didn't wake up, well, some called that a mercy. I've even heard tales of people snoozing through earthquakes, barn fires, and the occasional angry mob. After all, sleep deprivation was a way of life, and bodies adapted to the chaos. If you spent every day working from sunrise to sunset, barely eating, dodging mud and taxes, and worrying about eternal damnation, you'd sleep like a stone too. But here's the thing, some people learn to use sleep as an escape hatch from a world that seemed determined to test their patience. When faced with grief, illness, or apocalyptic fear, forecast with alarming regularity, some folks just wrapped themselves in a cloak, whispered a quick prayer, and drifted off. There's a strange sort of wisdom in that approach. So the next time you toss and turn in your memory foam bed, plagued by the glow of your phone or the hum of the fridge, spare a thought for your medieval predecessor. He had pigs in his bed, demons in his dreams, and bells in his ears, but somehow he still managed to catch some sleep. And now, as we leave the midnight confusion of the Middle Ages behind, prepare yourself for a new kind of nocturnal terror. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was cloaked in more than just snow. Picture it. Salem, Massachusetts, in the heart of winter, 1692. If you think New England snow is cold, try mixing it with a thick fog of suspicion, a dash of neighborly resentment, and a pinch of religious anxiety. The result? A recipe for the kind of tension you could slice with a frost-bitten butter knife. The Puritans who lived here believed they were building God's own city, one log cabin and one prayer meeting at a time. Though to be honest, it often felt more like they were constructing a fortress against the devil, complete with spiritual moats and pious drawbridges. Now, let me tell you, these folks had enough problems before witches even entered the picture. The town had just split from Salem town, over what else? Politics and religion. Fields stubbornly refused to yield decent crops. Smallpox had swept through nearby villages. leaving behind grief and empty chairs by the hearth. The endless skirmishes with local native tribes had everyone on edge, and you could practically hear the collective teeth grinding with every inheritance dispute and every sideways glance at an outsider. Just picture it. A community already fraying at the edges, then forced to endure one of those classic New England winters that makes you question every life choice since the Mayflower. So when something finally snapped, it didn't come as a gentle pop, but as a violent crack. The epicenter of this break, the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's anxious minister. Inside those walls, his 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began to act in ways that frankly would have gotten them TikTok famous today. If only for all the wrong reasons. They screamed at nothing. They tossed kitchenware like aspiring Olympic shot putters, their bodies twisted into shapes that would make a yoga instructor faint. Sometimes they'd freeze, eyes wide open, as if they'd just seen someone try to sleep in a medieval straw mattress. Yes, that level of horror. Word spread quickly, as it always does in small towns, especially when your closest neighbor is just a shout away through the paper-thin walls. Whispers fluttered from house to house. The girls were cursed. They claimed invisible hands pinched and bit them. Reverend Parris, not exactly a man brimming with medical knowledge, called in Dr. William Griggs. After poking, prodding, and probably prescribing a bit of old-fashioned rest, Griggs threw up his hands and declared the unthinkable: witchcraft. One word, and suddenly everyone's nightmares had crawled out from under the bed and started rearranging the furniture. If you thought those long, sleepless nights were bad before, now every creak in the dark could be the devil himself. And if Satan could set up shop in the minister's own home, who among them was truly safe? The answer, as it turns out, was absolutely no one. The afflicted girls, prodded by every adult in town and egged on by one another, began pointing fingers. At first their accusations landed on the usual suspects, women who already existed on the margins, the ones who muttered to themselves or didn't fit the Puritan mold. But it didn't stop there. The web of blame stretched and tangled, ensnaring the wealthy, the respectable, even the devout. Salem wasn't exactly a metropolis, but the panic that was brewing would soon send shockwaves far beyond its snowy boundaries. Once the idea of witchcraft took hold, it spread like a cold draft under a rickety door. At first, the girls minus Betty, Abigail, Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and a growing cast of the afflicted kept their fits and visions inside. But soon, their performances became public theatre. Imagine the scene. The girls convulsing and shrieking in the modest meeting house, eyes rolling, arms flailing, gasping about shadowy figures floating above the congregation. It was a show worthy of a sold-out Broadway run. Except, of course, the only tickets available were fear and suspicion. The first to be accused had little to defend themselves with. Sarah Good, for example, was a homeless beggar known for muttering to herself when neighbors shut their doors in her face. To the villagers, her mumbled curses were as good as spells. She smoked a pipe, snapped at children, and didn't exactly ooze charm. In the world of Puritan respectability, she was already halfway to the gallows. Sarah Osborne found herself under suspicion too, and for reasons only a Puritan could love. She'd skipped church for more than a year, and scandal of scandals, married her indentured servant after her first husband's death. Shocking, I know. In Salem, breaking with tradition was as good as signing a pact with the devil. Then there was Tituba, the enslaved woman from Barbados who lived in the Paris household. Her accent, her stories, her very presence made her an enigma. When pressed, minus perhaps literally, she confessed to witchcraft, but her confession wasn't the neat closure the village might have hoped for. Instead, it was a Pandora's box. Tituba spun a tale of a tall man in black, surely the devil, who forced her to sign a mysterious book. She saw yellow birds, red cats, and even spectral dogs. Most damning of all, she insisted she wasn't alone. There were other witches lurking in Salem. If you're wondering why that didn't calm things down, you've clearly never seen a Puritan in a panic. Tituba's confession was like tossing a torch into a hayloft. The accusations multiplied. New names were dragged into the light every week. Old grudges suddenly became righteous cause. If your cow died, or your bread refused to rise, or your baby wailed at the wrong moment, well, it had to be witchcraft. Defending anyone was risky business. To stand up for an accused witch was to paint a giant spectral target on your own back. The safest thing to do was stay quiet. And so the village became a tangled web of suspicion, with each thread sticky with fear. Enter the colonial government, led by Governor William Phipps, eager to restore order, or at least to keep his own head above the rising tide of hysteria. He created a special court, the Court of Oya and Termina. The name is French for to hear and determine, but in practice it was more like to panic and punish. This court was no sober pillar of justice. Instead of demanding hard evidence or reliable witnesses, it introduced the concept of spectral evidence. Now, if someone said they saw your ghostly double choking them in a dream, the court nodded sagely and jotted it down. Never mind that you had an airtight alibi. It didn't matter. How do you cross-examine a nightmare? In this topsy-turvy world, children became the star witnesses. Their fits in court grew more dramatic each day. Mary Walcott, for instance, would collapse the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If the prisoner glanced her way, she shrieked. If they didn't, she shrieked even louder. The judges, men like Samuel Sewell and Chief Justice William Stoughton, watched with grave expressions, as if the fate of the world hinged on every gasp and moan. Defense lawyers, there were none. If you stood accused, you stood alone against a machine that rewarded confessions and punished silence. Deny the charges, and the girls would convulse on cue. Confess, and you might live, if you named more names. The whole thing became a grim public spectacle. Crowds flocked from nearby towns to watch the proceedings. The accused were marched into court in chains, bewildered, powerless, and often destitute. Yet, not everyone bought the act. Some whispered doubts about the girl's sincerity. Others noticed that it was always the troublesome or inconvenient neighbors who ended up on trial. Still, to voice such doubts was to risk being swept up in the hysteria yourself. In Salem, to question the court was to question God's will. Logic had left the building. Fear now sat at the judge's bench, gavel in hand. On June 10th, 1692, Salem's gallows claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was no stranger to scandal. Known for her bright red dresses and for running a tavern, she'd faced witchcraft rumors before. At her trial, neighbors claimed her spirit had pinched them at night, that their infants died after she passed by, and that she kept enchanted dolls tucked away. Bridget denied every word, but the outcome was inevitable. Led to Gallows Hill, a bleak, windswept patch beyond the village, she found no mercy, no last prayer. The rope was pulled. The crowd watched in silence as the machinery of death lurched to life. The hangings came quick and hard after that. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some, like Rebecca Nurse, were pillars of the community. In fact, Rebecca's case was so shocking that the jury initially acquitted her, only to reverse their verdict under pressure from the court and the afflicted girls. Her last words drifted softly through the crowd, a chilling warning. I am as innocent as the child unborn. The noose cared little for innocence. August saw more executions. September 22nd brought the deadliest morning yet. 8 people hanged in a single sweep. Martha Corey, who had doubted the sanity of these trials from the start, was among them. Her husband, Giles Corey, suffered a fate even more gruesome. Refusing to enter a plea, he fell victim to an ancient English punishment, pressing. Stones were piled on his chest, one by one, while he lay stretched out in the dirt. After 3 agonizing days, his only recorded words were a defiant demand: more weight. When the dust finally settled, 19 people had been hanged. 1. Giles Corey was pressed to death. At least 5 more died in jail, awaiting a verdict that never came. Dozens confessed to crimes they'd never committed, hoping to save their own necks by naming others. More than 200 people had been accused before it was over. Gallows Hill cast a long shadow over Salem, over every field, every hearth, every heart. Here, fear didn't just change the law. It became the law, and justice was left dangling, blindfolded from the scaffold. But even as the executions drew crowds and attention, something sinister festered in the background. Hundreds of others, guilty of nothing but bad luck and bad timing, languished in foul-smelling, overcrowded jails, each one praying for a verdict, a miracle, or just a moment's reprieve from the stench. The true spell cast over Salem was only beginning to unravel. Let's step back for a moment and picture the scene. Salem's own tiny lockup was quickly overwhelmed, so the accused were scattered to jails in Ipswich, Boston, and any other place that could hold them. Imagine the smell: damp straw, sweat, fear. Their lives dangled in the balance as they sat crammed together in airless, reeking cells, waiting for any sign of hope, chains clinking every time someone shifted. Most of these people weren't the village oddballs or the shadowy figures you might expect. They were your neighbors, the woman who sold you bread, the man who helped fix your fence, even children. Their true crime? Sometimes it was a property dispute, sometimes just a poorly timed argument, or a pig wandering into the wrong garden and dying, which, in the logic of the time, was clear evidence of witchcraft. If someone's firewood wouldn't split, the axe was obviously hexed. The absurdity was suffocating, but in the heat of hysteria, every inconvenience became a supernatural plot. You could see it in cases like Mary East, sister of Rebecca Nurse, who was executed despite her reputation for kindness and deep faith. Mary was a mother of 7, the type of neighbor who'd show up with soup when you were sick. She was released once by the court, but that didn't last. After another wave of fits from the afflicted girls, she was seized again. In her last desperate plea, Mary begged the judges not for her own life, but for the madness to end, so no more innocent blood would stain the village. Her voice, calm and resolute, was soon silenced at the gallows. Then there was Dorothy Good, barely 4 years old, daughter of Sarah Good. When her mother was dragged off, Dorothy was interrogated. The poor child, bewildered and terrified, babbled nonsense. Yet her words were twisted into a confession. 8 months she spent chained in a cell, her mind never recovering from the ordeal. She emerged from prison, a shattered soul. The light in her eyes dimmed forever. It's enough to make even the crustiest medieval flea-ridden mattress seem like a haven by comparison. Not even pregnancy could shield women from the gallows. Elizabeth Proctor, wife of John Proctor, was convicted and sentenced to death. Her execution was postponed only because she was with child. That brief reprieve likely saved her. She gave birth in the darkness of the jail, and after the trials finally sputtered out, was released. But she'd lost her husband to the hangman's rope. The family she returned to was one forever marked by grief. Accusations didn't trickle, they cascaded, desperate to save their own skins. Some confessed to witchcraft, and, in a frantic game of hot potato, named others. Entire clans became swept into the spiral. Fathers, mothers, daughters, all fair game. The jails overflowed, food was scarce, and disease took hold. Some died before ever facing a trial, their names slipping quietly into the void, as yet more suspects were hauled in. At the height of the frenzy, it hardly mattered who you were. What mattered was who was willing to point a finger in your direction. By autumn of 1692, though, the cracks in this fever dream began to show, not because anyone suddenly remembered how justice is supposed to work, but because the hysteria finally overreached itself. Suddenly, people who had cheered the trials found themselves on the wrong end of the accusations. The snowball had rolled right over the so-called pillars of the community. One pivotal moment came with the arrest of Reverend George Burroughs, formerly a minister in Salem. Burroughs was educated, eloquent, and perhaps most dangerous of all, unpopular with certain powerful families. That was all it took. Hauled before the court and condemned, he faced the gallows. But just before his execution, Burroughs did something that stopped the crowd cold. He recited the Lord's Prayer, word perfect. According to the beliefs of the time, a true witch could never do such a thing. The executioners hesitated. The crowd murmured. Even the most hardened onlookers felt a jolt of doubt. Some wept openly. Yet, the execution continued. Still, a seed of disbelief had been planted. And then came the ultimate social plot twist. Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps, was accused. Suddenly, the hysteria wasn't just the villagers' problem. It was knocking on the governor's own door. Governor Phipps, already rattled by the mounting chaos and criticism, realized the situation was spiraling out of control. In October 1692, he abruptly dissolved the infamous court of Oyer and Termina. No more executions, no more new trials. The machinery of panic ground to a halt. Public opinion, once whipped into a frenzy, began to shift. Ministers who had stayed silent, or even cheered the proceedings, started to speak out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected religious minds, denounced the use of spectral evidence, the invisible, unprovable testimony that had sent so many to their deaths. He declared it better that 10 suspected witches escape than that one innocent person be condemned. It was a radical reversal, a slap in the face to months of collective madness. The village's appetite for blood was gone. Too many upright citizens had been accused. Too many funerals had been held. Families that had once gathered at the same table now sat in silence, unable to meet each other's eyes. Those who had once cheered the hangings now wondered what darkness had taken hold of them. The wave of confessions dried up. Some accusers vanished from the spotlight. Some simply faded away. And those who had screamed the loudest now looked at their shoes. With the hysteria finally burning itself out, Salem's world began to tilt back towards sanity. But the damage, that was already done. By the end of 1692, the legal machinery that had fueled the witch hunt was collapsing under its own absurdity. The court of Oyer and Termina was no more, replaced in early 1693 by a new, supposedly wiser body, the Superior Court of Judicature. This time, the rules had changed. No spectral evidence. Judges were openly skeptical of the afflicted girl's antics, and the result was dramatic. Acquittals soared. Of 56 new cases brought before the court, the majority ended with the accused walking free. Even those who had once confessed, hoping for mercy, now recanted. Fear, torture, and relentless pressure had forced them to lie, they said. The girl's wild performances, the writhing, the screaming, the pointing, lost their power. The grand drama of the courtroom was over. One of the cases that truly marked the unravelling was that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a deeply respected minister. Although he was never officially charged, the mere fact that such a devout and upright man could fall under suspicion showed just how corrupt and arbitrary the whole process had become. The new court, once a snarling beast, now slunk away quietly, releasing those still behind bars. First, those with little evidence against them. Eventually, even those who had previously confessed under duress found freedom. Meanwhile, the families of the dead began demanding justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of their father's confiscated property. The family of Rebecca Nurse, whose dignity had been murdered alongside her body, fought to clear her name. The village's sense of shame began to outweigh its fear. Churches split apart. Lifelong friendships withered into cold nods across muddy lanes. Salem's social fabric was shredded, and there was no needle fine enough to stitch it back together. Governor Phipps, scrambling to save face, both for himself and for the colony's reputation abroad, issued pardons. In 1693, the remaining prisoners were set free, but freedom came with a bill attached. Many families were forced to pay their own jail fees before being released. It was as if, after surviving the nightmare, you were handed an itemized receipt for the privilege. Lost your house, your health, your dignity? That'll be £5, thank you very much. Even in the aftermath, the absurdity clung to everything, like lice on a medieval pillow. When the dust settled, the toll was staggering. 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death under heavy stones, 5 dead in jail, and more than 200 accused. The court didn't just topple, it imploded, leaving behind a crater filled with grief, guilt, and disbelief. The trials might have ended, but Salem's wounds were raw, festering, and far from healed. The gallows stood silent, the jails emptied. But Salem found no peace in the quiet. The ghosts that haunted the town weren't those of witches. They were the ghosts of guilt, suspicion, and regret. What began with a handful of sick children had blossomed into a communal act of destruction. Families torn apart, reputations ruined, trust shattered. Those who survived had to pick their way through the wreckage. Neighbors avoided each other's gaze. The same people who once knelt together in prayer had testified against each other in court. Some of the afflicted girls, the ones whose fits had set the world alight, quietly left town, melting into the background. A few, like Ann Putnam Jr., would later try to seek forgiveness. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and through tears confessed her role in the horror, blaming Satan's delusion for her actions. But for many, remorse came too late. The wounds were too deep for words to heal. Even the judges, those who had signed the death warrants, could not escape the shadow. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent, was one of the few to publicly admit his guilt. In 1697, during a church service, he stood as a minister read his confession and prayer for forgiveness. The congregation watched in stunned silence. It was a rare moment of accountability in a world desperate to forget. But forgetting was impossible. The families of the condemned demanded compensation. Petitions swamped the Massachusetts government. They asked for official pardons for their loved ones' property to be returned, for a formal acknowledgement that the dead were innocent. Slowly, grudgingly, the authorities responded. In 1711, the colony passed a bill that restored the rights and reputations of some of the victims and offered a modest financial settlement to their heirs. But even this was incomplete. Some families, like the Corys and the Proctors, were left out entirely. The stain of suspicion, like a stubborn mildew, refused to be scrubbed away. Even as the years passed, whispers of witchcraft lingered across New England. But nowhere was the shame more deeply woven into the fabric of daily life than in Salem. Eventually, the village tried to escape its own reflection by changing its name to Danvers Gallows Hill. Where so many had died was left unmarked, as if burying the memory would erase the guilt. But that memory clung to sermons, to bedtime stories, to the silences that stretched between former friends. Salem was never cursed by witches. It was cursed by fear, pride, and the unchecked power of a system run amok. And that curse outlived the screams and the executions. The Salem witch trials ended over 3 centuries ago, but their echo still reverberates in our understanding of justice, fear, and the fragility of truth. What happened in 1692 wasn't just a bizarre episode of mass panic. It was a full-blown collapse of logic, compassion, and legal integrity. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, became executioners simply by believing too quickly and questioning too little. The courts, meant to shield the innocent, became engines of oppression. Religion was twisted into a weapon. Testimony became theatre. Silence became its own kind of guilt. Perhaps the most chilling lesson from Salem is how fast it all happened. In mere months, fear bulldozed fact. Old grudges rebranded as spiritual crusades became death sentences. No devils required, just belief in them and a willingness to look the other way. Still, the aftermath of Salem forged lessons that rippled through American history. For decades and centuries, the trials were cited in debates over due process and civil rights. Nearly a century later, the framers of the US Constitution wrote explicit safeguards against things like ex post facto laws and bills of attainder, the very legal traps that doomed Salem's accused. The right to legal counsel, to confront your accusers, and to demand concrete evidence. These principles were hammered out on the anvil of Gallows Hill. Today the phrase witch hunt gets tossed around with reckless abandon, usually with little regard for the real terror it represents. But Salem wasn't a metaphor. It was a town where people were executed for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. The most enduring warning from Salem isn't just about witches or old-timey superstitions. It's about the danger of fear, unchecked by reason. When fear is backed by power, whether it's a court, a church, or a government, it becomes a force almost impossible to stop. The gallows may be gone. The the courtroom silent, but the warning remains. Truth is delicate, justice isn't automatic, and history has a habit of circling back unless we remember what happened in places like Salem. So, as we leave the haunted fields of 1692 behind, let's turn our attention to another unexpected figure who reshaped history, not with panic or superstition, but sheer ambition and political savvy. To do that, we'll need to pack our bags, dust off our togas, and travel back to ancient Rome, where a certain Fulvia was about to make her mark. Let's set the stage. Rome. Around 83 BCE, the city is a beehive of marble and mud, where ambition and anxiety buzz louder than the street vendors. In one of its grander townhouses, nestled between the chaos of the Forum and the quieter hills, a girl named Fulvia was born into the Fulvia, a family with a reputation as sharp as its name, and a social standing they'd clawed up from plebeian roots. Now the Fulvia weren't Rome's oldest blue bloods, but they were no strangers to the corridors of power. They'd produced consuls, generals, and orators, enough to fill several family dinners with arguments about who was more important. Their family crest might as well have been a ladder, because every generation seemed determined to climb it, rung by rung, even if it meant elbowing a senator or two along the way. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was a man known less for his political triumphs and more for the way he tripped over his words. His nickname, Bambalio, literally meant the stammerer. Imagine being remembered in history, mostly for your verbal fumbles, like if your legacy was the ancient equivalent of autocorrect fails. But where Bambalio hesitated, Fulvia charged ahead. If her father's speeches stumbled, Fulvia's mere presence commanded attention. From her earliest days, she wasn't the kind of child to be seen and not heard. She was the kind who made the room go quiet, just to see what she'd say next. Picture the world. Fulvia grew up in the Fulvius household was a crossroads for the power players of Rome. Senators in togas with wine-stained lips debated policy and bribery at her family's dinner table. Generals, still dusty from the road, argued about campaigns and coin. Elections, betrayals, and power grabs weren't distant rumors. They were the background noise to Fulvia's daily life. She grew up watching politics happen, not just in marble halls, but in whispered alliances, in the passing of notes, in the tension that crackled during funerals and festivals. It was a world where a well-timed rumor could topple a career, and a marriage could shift the balance of power overnight. Now, for most Roman girls of Fulvia's rank, the script was clear. Be refined, be educated, be invisible. You were supposed to be the quiet partner, the polished jewel in the family's crown, always supportive but never stealing the spotlight. Fulvia, on the other hand, read the stage directions and promptly rewrote the play. She was rich, yes. Educated, certainly. She could quote philosophers with the best of them, but she was also aware of her own power and connections, and she wasn't afraid to use them. While the historical record is a bit foggy about her childhood, her later life leaves behind a trail of evidence like footprints in fresh mud. Every step says, this was a woman who watched, learned, and never flinched from the game. Fulvia didn't just blend into the mosaic of Roman matrons. She stood out, bold and brash, a personality that could fill the Senate House even if she wasn't technically allowed inside. Sharp-witted, politically literate, and fearless. She was a force even when the forces of Rome tried to contain her. Imagine growing up surrounded by the world's most powerful men, and instead of shrinking back, you start planning how to outmaneuver them. And what a world it was. Rome in Fulvia's youth was less the eternal city, and more the eternal circus. The Republic was splitting at the seams. Civil war lurked around every corner. Generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar waged not just battles but vendettas. The rules that had held Rome together for centuries were crumbling fast. Alliances shifted with the seasons. One day's hero was the next day's exile. It was a pressure cooker, and Fulvia was coming of age right in the middle of it. Where most people saw chaos and ducked for cover, Fulvia saw opportunity and started sharpening her tools. This wasn't a household training up the next model Roman wife. Fulvia was raised in an environment that taught her politics was a blood sport, and she intended to be more than a spectator. For her, Politics wasn't an arena reserved for men. It was a battlefield, and she was determined to master it. While most women were cast as supporting characters, Fulvia was already auditioning for the lead. She would go on to marry 3 of the most influential men of her era, each one a radical in his own right. But Fulvia didn't just marry power. She became power's fiercest partner. She wasn't content to be the woman behind the man. She was the woman beside, and sometimes in front of the man. She would command armies, incite revolts, and eventually become the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a mythical goddess, but as herself, her own face, her own name, stamped into history. Rome, for all its grandeur, was not prepared for Fulvia. But Fulvia was more than ready for Rome. Let's talk about Fulvia's first foray into political marriage, her union with Publius Clodius Pulcher. Now Clodius was not your average Roman aristocrat. He was something of a political pyromaniac, always one step away from scandal, always ready to light the next fire. To the Senate, he was a walking disaster. To the common people, he was a hero of the streets. And to Fulvia, he was the ultimate political opportunity. Their marriage, struck sometime in the early 50s BCE, wasn't just a social contract, it was a tactical alliance. Clodius had transformed the Roman Republic into his own personal theatre, and Fulvia was more than just a supporting actress. She was his co-star. Clodius, ever the showman, once disguised himself as a woman to crash an exclusive women-only religious ceremony in Caesar's own home. A stunt so outrageous, it left even the scandal-hardened Romans gasping. His popularity only grew with each new outrage. He later gave up his patrician status to run for the office of tribune of the plebs, which handed him the ultimate political weapon, the power to veto the Senate. Clodius knew how to work the crowd, and Fulvia, far from being a background figure, was right there in the thick of it. Roman sources hint that Fulvia was actively involved in her husband's political machine. She wasn't lurking in the shadows. She was front and center, engaging with supporters, appearing at rallies, and turning their home into headquarters for Clodian politics. Where other Roman wives might have been dusting the silver, Fulvia was organizing the next campaign. Together, they were Rome's original power couple, bold, brash, and unapologetically populist. But power in Rome always comes at a price. In 52 BCE, Clodius was ambushed and killed on the Appian Way by the henchmen of his rival, Titus Annius Milo. His murder sent a shockwave through the city, and if you think Fulvia was going to retire quietly into mourning, think again. Fulvia orchestrated a political funeral that still echoes through the history books. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body through the forum, wounds raw and visible, transforming her personal grief into a public spectacle. The city was horrified. The people erupted in rage. Riots broke out, and in the chaos, the grand old Senate house went up in flames. Fulvia had taken tragedy and spun it into political gold. She knew exactly how to wield emotion as a weapon, how to turn a funeral into a revolution. It was her first solo move on Rome's political chessboard, and it was a checkmate. The city would never look at her, or at Roman women, the same way again. But Fulvia didn't sit in the ashes of her husband's pyre for long. In Rome, political capital was as perishable as leftover bread, and Fulvia understood that freshness was everything. Not long after Clodius's death, she struck again, this time marrying Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising star in the political world and a dyed-in-the-wool supporter of Julius Caesar. On paper, Curio looked like an odd match. He was flamboyant, dramatic, and loved a good spectacle, but under the showmanship was a sharp mind and real political muscle. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio had his finger on the pulse of a city about to explode. Fulvia didn't pick Curio for romance. She chose him as her next move in the great game. She was shoring up her place in the populist camp and keeping her ties to Caesar strong. Through Curio, Fulvia kept Clodius's supporters active, rebranding their movement and keeping the city's restless crowds engaged. She didn't just marry into the political movement, she helped steer it. But Rome was spinning out of control. Caesar and Pompey's rivalry was boiling over. Curio leapt into the fray, throwing his lot in with Caesar. Fulvia, ever the strategist, stayed involved, organizing support, marshalling resources, and keeping the home front ready for whatever the future might throw at them. In 49 BCE, Curio led a fateful campaign in Africa, hoping to secure the region for Caesar. It ended in disaster. Curio was killed in battle, his army destroyed. Fulvia was widowed again, and Rome watched to see if this would finally send her into obscurity. It didn't. Curio's death only made Fulvia more formidable. She had now lost 2 husbands to the chaos of Roman politics, both men swept away by the tides of civil war. Yet each time Fulvia emerged stronger, her reputation as a political widow with teeth growing fiercer. She was not going anywhere. Her third and most notorious marriage would seal her place in Roman legend. Sometime around 47 BCE, Fulvia joined forces with Mark Antony, a man as ambitious as he was unpredictable. Antony was a general on the rise, Caesar's most trusted ally in the field, but his personal life was a tornado of drinking, gambling, and scandal. If Rome was a circus, Antony was one of its wilder performers, but with Fulvia at his side, he found not just a partner, but a co-conspirator. She brought the street smarts and political connections Antony desperately needed. He, in turn, offered her access to the military and a new level of influence. Their marriage was less a love story and more a merger of empires. By now, Fulvia was a veteran of political warfare. She'd buried 2 husbands and outfoxed more enemies than most senators could count. Antony, for all his bravado, recognized Fulvia's value. He let her open his letters, issue orders in his name, sit in on meetings, and even influence appointments. This wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. Roman sources, never shy about their biases, painted Fulvia as domineering and hungry for power. But what truly unsettled them was her refusal to play by the rules. She acted like a Roman man in a world that had no script for a woman like her. Then, in 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated, and the city tipped into chaos once again. Antony rushed to secure his claim as Caesar's successor, but it was Fulvia who held the keys to the city. While Antony formed the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia took command in the capital, managing patronage, directing street gangs, keeping Antony's supporters fired up. She even orchestrated Antony's official reconciliation with Octavian by arranging a marriage between her daughter Claudia and Octavian, a political maneuver that would later backfire spectacularly. In public, Fulvia was more than Antony's wife. She was his representative, his equal, and sometimes his superior. For the first time in history, coins were minted bearing both Antony's image and Fulvia's name. This was no goddess or allegorical figure. This was Fulvia, the woman herself, stamped into Rome's currency and consciousness. She wasn't hiding behind the curtains of power. She was standing right in its blinding spotlight. But in Rome, power was always borrowed, never owned outright. Fulvia was about to test just how far a woman could go before the city's ancient machinery snapped back. And that brings us to the next act of Fulvia's dramatic story. While Mark Antony pursued military campaigns and political deals across the Roman world, it was Fulvia who controlled the streets of Rome. The final gambit of her life, her rebellion, her exile, and the way history would remember her, was just beginning to unfold. Let me take you back to a Rome that buzzed with danger, where the scent of ambition mixed freely with the dust and sweat of the city's crowded streets. Picture the scene. Mark Antony is off chasing glory in distant lands, but in the heart of the capital, Fulvia has her hands firmly on the levers of power. She's not just Antony's wife, and certainly not a decorative presence in a senator's atrium. In every way that mattered, Fulvia was running the show in Rome, regent in all but title, a force of nature in a city built on the backs of men who thought women belonged behind curtains, not behind armies. This was the bloody post-assassination circus of Caesar's Rome. The rules had been upended, swords were sheathed, but the civil war raged on, now fought with bribes, whispered threats, and the occasional mob in the forum. Fulvia, with the kind of nerve that would make a modern political fixer blush, kept Antony's flame burning in the capital. While he was out making deals and waging wars, she was the one directing allies, keeping the urban plebs on side, and negotiating with the kind of Senate factions that would sooner walk barefoot on a Roman street than take orders from a woman. But take orders they did, because Fulvia spoke in gold, silver, and the occasional threat. Forget the image of the Roman matron at her loom. Fulvia was issuing decrees, financing loyal troops, and making sure every piece of legislation that slithered through the Senate had Antony's fingerprints all over it. Some ancient writers, especially the ones who made a sport out of blaming women for Rome's every hiccup, cast Fulvia as manipulative, shrewish, even bloodthirsty. But if you strip away the misogyny, you get something far more interesting. A woman simply doing politics in a world that had no recipe for a woman doing anything but weaving or weeping. Fulvia was making alliances, influencing military commanders, and even stepping into the spotlight herself, meeting with centurions, negotiating land deals for grizzled veterans, and reminding soldiers that their loyalty to Antony came with tangible rewards. Of course, all this came at a price. The aristocrats in Rome, especially the ones orbiting Octavian, Caesar's heir, and Antony's not-so-secret nemesis, resented Fulvia's power. To them she was a meddler, a dangerous anomaly, with too much control over the armies, the laws, and the hearts of men who should have known better. Her independence, her ability to maneuver without a male guardian, shook the very foundations of what a Roman woman was supposed to be. But Fulvia was no fool. She saw the cracks widening between Antony and Octavian. She understood, perhaps better than either man, that the Republic couldn't survive with both of them clawing for the crown, and so she decided to stop playing defense. No more scheming from the shadows. It was time for confrontation. So in 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She declared war, open war, on Octavian. Not just with sharp words or political sabotage, but with legions, banners, and the thunder of marching feet. While Antony was still far away, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother and a sitting consul, raised the stakes. Their cause, officially, was to defend Antony's interests and protect his loyal veterans from Octavian's ruthless land grabs. But anyone with eyes could see Fulvia's hand behind every move. This wasn't backroom plotting. This was a full-blown military rebellion, led shockingly for Rome by a woman. The whole city gossiped about it. Ancient sources liked to pretend Lucius was the main actor. But let's be honest, if this were a modern political drama, Lucius would be the sidekick nervously clutching his notes while Fulvia stormed onto the stage and took charge of the script. She rallied troops, stirred up the public, wrote urgent letters to generals, and according to more than one rumor, even issued battlefield orders herself. Rome buzzed with stories of Fulvia's iron will, her speeches to the soldiers, her ability to force Lucius into battles he would have skipped if left to his own devices. The conflict that erupted became known as the Perisine War, a civil war with Fulvia at its core. Octavian's controversial land redistribution, booting Italians off their ancestral farms to make room for his own veterans, sparked outrage across the peninsula. Fulvia seized that rage and turned it into a weapon, painting Octavian as a tyrant betraying Caesar's legacy. With Lucius as her public face in the Senate, and Fulvia pulling the strings, they mustered 8 legions and seized the hilltop city of Perugia, modern Perugia. This was Fulvia's gambit, her moment as Rome's first and only female warlord. Octavian, never one to let a challenge go unanswered, responded with brutal efficiency. He marched on Perugia, laying siege to the city through the biting winter of 41 to 40 BCE. Supplies ran thin. The city starved, battered by both enemy fire and the chill of betrayal. Fulvia, trapped inside with Lucius and a dwindling band of loyalists, watched her dream of victory wither with every empty grain sack. Some nights, I swear you could hear the groaning of Rome's old order as it buckled under the weight of this unprecedented rebellion. By the start of 40 BCE, the game was up. Perugia surrendered. Lucius Antonius, perhaps for the sake of sparing Antony's feelings or avoiding an even bloodier feud, was allowed to live. But Fulvia, the woman who had dared to command riots, armies, and street politics, was declared too dangerous for Rome. Her punishment, exile. Fulvia was banished from the city she had once ruled, sent across the Adriatic to the Greek town of Sicyon, a kind of political limbo for Rome's most inconvenient troublemakers. You can almost picture her arrival, the once unstoppable Fulvia, stepping ashore in Greece, hoping to be reunited with Antony. Maybe she imagined a tearful reunion, a hero's welcome, some recognition for the war she'd waged in his name. Instead, she found silence. Antony did not come. Instead of gratitude, Fulvia was met with the cold realization that her husband was already entangled in the web of Cleopatra's Egypt. While Fulvia had been fighting for Antony's legacy, Antony was raising glasses at Cleopatra's banquets, the wine flowing as freely as his new affections. The betrayal was crushing. Not just as a wife, but as a political partner, Fulvia had risked everything for Antony's cause, her reputation, her safety, her very life. But here, in exile, she discovered that Antony's loyalties had shifted. Some ancient historians, like Plutarch, claim Antony was furious at Fulvia for starting the Parisine War without his explicit consent. Others suggest he welcomed her downfall, seeing it as a handy way to clear the path for a political marriage with Octavian's sister, a deal Fulvia would never have tolerated. Either way, Antony's absence in her hour of need spoke volumes. Not that Fulvia was entirely abandoned. Some of Antony's old soldiers, fiercely loyal to her, pleaded for reconciliation between the estranged couple, but by then, Fulvia's health had begun to fail. The siege, the hunger, the heartbreak of betrayal and exile, it all took its toll. In Sicyon, far from the city she'd once dominated, Fulvia died in 40 BCE. Illness, exhaustion, and perhaps a broken spirit. Her end was as lonely as her rebellion had been bold. She was only about 43 years old. For Antony, her death was a political windfall. With Fulvia out of the picture, he quickly patched things up with Octavian and sealed the deal by marrying Octavian's sister, Octavia. The triumvirs were united once more, at least for a little while. Not because of any great statesmanship, but because the one woman willing to challenge them all was now gone. Fulvia's memory didn't get the hero send-off it deserved. No marble statues, no grand funeral procession, not even a token speech in the Senate. Instead, there was only silence, the kind of silence that tells you Rome had no idea what to do with a woman like her. But if the men in power hoped to erase her, they were in for a surprise. Fulvia's fingerprints were all over the ruins of the Republic, and her story refused to fade. After her death, the men she had outmaneuvered and sometimes outshouted, Antony, Octavian, and their allies, set about rewriting history. They couldn't allow Fulvia to stand as a model for female ambition, so they painted her as the villain, the shrill troublemaker, the reason for the Parisine War, the wedge between Antony and Octavian, the embodiment of everything wrong with the crumbling Republic. Ancient writers, almost all men with skin in the game, lined up to blame Fulvia for every misfortune. She was accused of dragging Lucius Antonius into war, provoking Octavian, and even causing Antony's estrangement from Rome. But let's pause for a second. Were these accusations fair? Not even close. Fulvia was playing by the same brutal rules as every other power broker in Rome. She was no more ambitious than Julius Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and certainly less ruthless than Octavian would one day become. Her only real crime was being a woman who acted like a man, and Rome simply couldn't process that. She didn't confine herself to the shadows, whispering advice or arranging marriages. She was in the thick of it, writing to generals, organizing street protests, demanding loyalty from the very soldiers who decided the fate of empires. That made her dangerous, not just to Octavian's plans, but to the very way Rome understood itself. Even Antony, the man she had fought so hard to protect, found it politically convenient to blame Fulvia for the chaos. After all, her death cleared the way for a political alliance he desperately needed. No one raised a monument for Fulvia. No one marked her passing with the respect due to someone who had once held Rome in her grasp. She was quietly swept aside, her story almost lost beneath the waves of slander and silence. Yet despite every effort to erase her, Fulvia's impact lingered. She had done what no woman had dared before, raised armies, shaped elections, negotiated with generals, and fought a civil war in her own name. She was the first Roman woman whose face appeared on coins, not as a goddess or a metaphor, but as an actual political actor. For every line in the ancient sources that tried to bury her, there were deeds that simply couldn't be ignored. The damage to her reputation was deliberate, but so was her undeniable presence in the grand saga of Rome. Fulvia's defiance still echoes. If you know where to listen, her story ends in a hush, but her legacy shouts from the margins. In the generations after her death, historians and poets struggled to fit her into their narratives. Fulvia didn't just bend the rules for women. She smashed them, ignored the pieces, and then built something entirely new out of the wreckage. In a world where women were supposed to influence through subtlety or marriage, Fulvia was a storm. She commanded through policy, through war, through the kind of public spectacle Rome just wasn't ready for. She wasn't remembered as a consort, but as a commander, and yet Roman historians preferred to focus on her audacity rather than her achievements. They rewrote her as shrill, power-hungry, and disruptive. But if you read between the lines, another Fulvia emerges, a pioneer who minted coins with her name, orchestrated political coalitions, bent marriage alliances to her will, and played the street politics of Rome with astonishing skill. Through the civil wars that fractured the Republic, Fulvia was not a bystander but a major player. Her downfall came not from a lack of ability, but from a collision of bad timing and even worse gender politics. Had she been born a man, you'd see her name in marble alongside the likes of Caesar and Cicero. Instead, she was cast as the wicked woman who dared too much. Still, Fulvia's legacy refused to be buried. Later Roman women, Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and yes, even Cleopatra, though in a different league entirely, followed in the footsteps Fulvia had carved. They manipulated emperors, commanded armies, dictated succession, but Fulvia did it first, and with no imperial title to cushion her fall. In recent years, historians have started to look at Fulvia through a new lens, no longer a cautionary tale, but a trailblazer, one of the most politically active women in all of Roman history. She tested the boundaries of female power and paid the ultimate price. She didn't just live through the age of the triumvirs, she challenged them, and in doing so, left fingerprints in every dark corner of Rome's collapse. Fulvia was never a footnote, she was a force, a woman centuries ahead of her time. And that's the thing about history. The strangest, boldest, and most inconvenient truths have a way of resurfacing, no matter how hard the old guard tries to sweep them under the rug. Fulvia's story is a reminder that the echoes of the past are rarely as quiet as we think. Now let's leave the crumbling marble of Rome behind. As centuries rolled on, the torch of rebellion passed to new hands in new lands. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country teetering between two worlds. That summer, America felt split down the middle, standing at the intersection of its own past and a future begging to break free. I remember the air being thick with tension, as if everyone was holding their breath. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't just something you picked up from the culture, it was literally carved into the law. Black Americans were told exactly where they could eat, which schools their children could attend, which seats on the bus they could warm, and even which water fountain was deemed safe for their lips. And don't even get me started on voting. Trying to vote, if you were black, was like trying to win a game where the rules changed every time you rolled the dice. Meanwhile, police brutality was as commonplace as Sunday sermons. Lynching, though less frequent than in the darkest decades before, still cast a long shadow. In places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful demonstrators faced not just jeers or angry stares, they met police dogs with bared teeth and fire hoses that could knock a grown man off his feet. But here's the thing about change. It never really asks for permission, does it? By 1963, the civil rights movement wasn't some fringe topic. It was the headline. Sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom rides on buses, boycotts that emptied city centers. These had become as familiar as the weather report. Names like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis weren't just names anymore. They were the faces of resistance, symbols of a growing storm. The March on Washington didn't just spring up out of thin air. after a long committee meeting and a few sandwiches. This was an idea that had been simmering for decades, brewing stronger with every injustice. Back in the 1940s, Philip Randolph, a labor organizer with a knack for persistence, had first floated the radical idea: what if thousands of black Americans marched on the nation's capital to push President Roosevelt into desegregating the defense industry? That protest never took off, because Roosevelt blinked first and signed the executive order. But the seed had been planted, and by the early 60s it had grown into something much bigger and more urgent. Now in 1963, the stakes weren't just jobs in factories. They were everything: dignity, voting rights, integrated schools, equal pay, and above all, the right to live without fear of the knock at the door or the flash of blue lights. Randolph wasn't alone this time. He was joined by other giants: Bayard Rustin, the man who could organize chaos into choreography, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose words could lift a room and move a nation. Together, with a coalition of over a dozen civil rights organizations, they revived the vision of a mass march on Washington. Sure, these groups sometimes fought like cats in a sack, tactics, timing, and tone up for debate, but they understood something vital. Divided, they were just noise. United, they were thunder. The countdown to the march was like watching a storm gather. Buses were reserved, flyers spread like wildfire, and word of mouth moved faster than the morning paper could hit your doorstep. Across cities and small towns, black Americans and their allies started to prepare. Some picked out their best Sunday clothes, others baked sandwiches or saved up for bus fare. You could feel the anticipation in the air, humming with possibility and a little bit of terror. Now, I've organized a medieval feast before. Trust me, herding peasants is nothing compared to planning a protest for over 100,000 people in Washington, D.C. The logistics sounded like a recipe for disaster. Food, water, transportation, sound systems so you could actually hear the speeches, bathrooms. Because let's be honest, nobody wants to relive the days of medieval chamber pots. Plus medical teams, permits, crowd control, safety plans, and really the whole 9 yards. And yet, against all odds, they pulled it off. At the heart of this organized chaos was Bayard Rustin. He was a master tactician, a chess player mapping out every move before the first pawn left the board. Despite being openly gay and often pushed to the background because of it, Rustin was unflappable. He'd studied non-violence in India, learning straight from Gandhi's disciples. He'd marched, been jailed, beaten, and watched by the FBI, but none of it rattled him. He saw this march as a chance to show the world just how powerful disciplined, non-violent protest could be, when every detail was planned with military precision. 8 weeks, that's all they had. In that short window, Rustin and his team took a dream and turned it into a timetable, a bus schedule, a set of handwritten instructions for marshals with armbands and training in crowd control. The official name was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That "and" was crucial, not some throwaway detail. Dr. King would become the soul of the day, but Randolph and Rustin made sure the demands spoke to both racial justice and economic opportunity. Jobs, minimum wage, workers' rights, and civil rights, all woven together. Of course, the pressure cooker was hissing on all sides. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors were sweating bullets. They worried about riots, violence, even bloodshed. Civil rights leaders promised a peaceful demonstration, but the government wasn't taking any chances. The National Guard was on standby. Hospitals in D.C. were put on alert. Liquor stores were ordered to close, and federal workers were told, maybe just work from home today, before work from home was even a thing. And always, there was the question of unity. The big 6 civil rights organizations, NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, the National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, could barely agree on pizza toppings, let alone protest tactics. Some wanted to push the envelope. Others preferred careful negotiation. The younger firebrands in SNCC were growing restless with King's patient approach. But on this, everyone agreed. The time for silence was over. Rustin's plan looked like the kind of playbook you'd expect from a general, not a protest organizer. Every bus and train was tracked, every speaker's slot scheduled to the minute, every possible scenario mapped out. They weren't just planning a march. They were orchestrating a moment that would echo in the conscience of the nation, a collective act of hope and courage. And as the final days ticked away, you could feel the world watching. The road to the march was paved with fear, hope, and the stubborn determination of people who refused to wait any longer for justice. The dream was no longer just an idea. It was becoming footprints on the streets of Washington, a heartbeat that pulsed with unity and resolve. Next up, we'll step into the day itself, as history unfolds in real time. August 28, 1963. Washington, D.C. was a steam room with monuments. If you've never experienced a capital city wrapped in a wool blanket of humidity, count your blessings. By 9 in the morning, the air was already thick enough to chew, and sweat was the day's unofficial dress code. But none of that deterred the marchers. They came anyway, by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, by the 100,000s. Picture it, entire families piling into buses at midnight from Atlanta, pastors crammed into station wagons in Ohio, students hitchhiking from New York, factory workers from Detroit, all converging on the National Mall as though gravity itself had shifted toward justice. It was a parade of America's patchwork, black and white, young and old, grandmothers in church hats, college kids in denim, union men gripping homemade signs, nuns in crisp habits. Some had pressed their best clothes as if attending an Easter service. Others wore practical shoes for marching, and a few clung to battered suitcases with everything they owned. You could spot celebrities, Harry Belafonte chatting with Joan Baez, Marlon Brando dodging requests for autographs, and Bob Dylan looking like he'd wandered in from a Greenwich Village coffeehouse. But nobody was there for stargazing. The real draw was the sense that the ground beneath their feet was about to become hallowed by history. The authorities had braced for chaos, convinced that 250,000 people would mean riots, broken shop windows, and headlines screaming mayhem in the capital. Instead, they got a city transformed by order and optimism. Volunteers in bright armbands shepherded the crowds like seasoned festival staff. The Red Cross handed out water, and with a knowing look, advised everyone to hydrate. Though let's be honest, in that heat, most folks were sweating it out as fast as they could drink it in. Spontaneous choirs cropped up under every patch of shade, their voices weaving together gospel and protest songs that bounced off the marble pillars of the Lincoln Memorial. The chants, "Jobs and Freedom," echoed and re-echoed, picked up by groups clustered along the reflecting pool, until it seemed like the whole city was humming with purpose. For many black Americans, simply standing on that lawn was its own act of defiance. To be counted, seen and heard in front of Lincoln's giant, impassive gaze, that was a revolution, quiet but thunderous. It was a moment generations had prayed for, an unbroken chain running from emancipation through Jim Crow, now winding its way into the nation's front yard. At the stroke of noon, the program began. A parade of leaders took the stage, each carrying the weight of their communities, each representing a different corner of the civil rights struggle. Labor unions, student organizers, clergy and activists, their accents were as varied as their hometowns, but their message was stitched together by urgency. They called for equal pay, an end to school segregation, fair housing, jobs with dignity, and a final stop to police brutality. Music soared above the speeches. Mahalia Jackson, the queen of gospel, belted out spirituals that seemed to part the sticky air, her voice rolling over the crowd and up the steps of the memorial. Marian Anderson, once barred from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for the multitudes, her dignity a rebuke to every closed door. As the hours ticked by, the energy didn't wane, it sharpened. The sense of anticipation was electric. Everyone knew the headline act was still to come. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. hadn't spoken yet, but the crowd could feel the weight of his presence, like the hush before a thunderclap. By mid-afternoon, it wasn't exhaustion that quieted the crowd, but reverence. People pressed closer to the Lincoln Memorial steps, seeking shade but mostly drawn by the magnetic pull of the moment. Dr. King appeared at the podium. Every inch the preacher, dark suit, polished shoes, an air of calm that barely contained the fire burning in his eyes. He carried typed remarks, words polished by a committee, and a sleepless night, but everyone who'd seen him speak before knew that King's greatest power wasn't on the page. He began methodically, painting a picture of the broken promises and raw wounds of segregation. 100 years later, he declared, invoking Lincoln's legacy, the Negro is still not free. His voice was a living thing, rising and falling, drawing the listeners in with the rhythm of a sermon. Every repetition, every pause, every crescendo was a carefully tuned instrument. The crowd responded in kind. Some nodded, some squeezed the hands of their neighbors, others blinked away tears behind sunglasses. A few held up signs that simply read one word, now. And then a new current swept through the moment. Mahalia Jackson, who'd been standing just behind King, leaned in and called out, her voice ringing above the quiet. Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. Then he set aside his prepared remarks, gripped the podium as if steadying himself on the edge of history, and began to speak from his very soul. I have a dream, he proclaimed, and with each repetition, the idea grew larger, more vivid, more undeniable. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. The crowd leaned in, holding their collective breath. I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. The words seemed to hang in the air, as if daring the world not to believe them. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This was no longer just a speech. It was prophecy. It was a vision so raw and real that it seemed to burn away the summer haze. By the time King reached his final crescendo, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty. We are free at last. The crowd erupted, their applause rolling like thunder across the mall. Some shouted, some wept openly. Some fell silent, stunned by the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. But the true power of the March on Washington was not just in the poetry, or the music, or even the thunderous applause. It was in the multitude, the sea of faces and stories woven together for one day. They came from everywhere, Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, California, and every small town in between. Some were battle-hardened activists with the scars to prove it. Others had never left their hometowns before. They packed peanut butter sandwiches, rode in stifling buses for a day and a night, sometimes sleeping in their Sunday clothes, all to bear witness. Most were ordinary people, teachers, postal workers, maids, steel workers, and students. They didn't see themselves as history makers. They weren't seeking fame or political power. They came to be counted, to lend their voices, to write themselves into the story of America. They were the change, whether or not they realized it. Children darted through the crowd, girls with white ribbons in their hair, boys clutching hand-painted signs wobbling on broomsticks. Parents hoisted their little ones onto shoulders so they could see the speakers, their faces alight with hope and awe. For these kids, the march wasn't a distant historical event or a footnote in a textbook. It was the start of a new world, a living memory they would carry for the rest of their lives. Some faces in the crowd would become legends. A young John Lewis, just 23 years old, stood out for his fiery spirit. As the representative of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he had written a speech so raw and uncompromising that senior leaders asked him to dial it back minutes before he spoke. He did, but only just. His words still rattled the crowd, demanding action, not patience. Then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman allowed to speak that day. She stood at the podium, not for herself, but reading a collective statement on behalf of the women who had powered the movement behind the scenes. The organizers had been criticized for sidelining female voices, and Bates's brief but pointed remarks highlighted a truth. Even in a movement for equality, some voices still struggled to be heard. Everywhere you looked, you saw evidence of the movement's diversity and its tensions. Union leaders, rabbis, nuns, priests, students and workers all stood shoulder to shoulder. They didn't always agree. Some clung to King's philosophy of non-violence. Others, inspired by Malcolm X or frustrated by the slow trickle of progress, wanted to push harder, confront the system more directly. But for that one day, unity held sway. The differences faded into the background, replaced by a shared sense that history was theirs to shape. The visual symphony was breathtaking. White and black hands linked in solidarity, Freedom Now buttons pinned to every lapel, and the synchronized heartbeat of 250,000 people gathered beneath the gaze of Lincoln. These weren't just witnesses to history, they were its authors. Of course, the world watching on television saw a movement perfectly choreographed, pure inspiration, pure unity. But back behind the curtain, the reality was messier, more human. What looked seamless was held together by equal parts hope and frantic compromise. Bayard Rustin, the mastermind behind the logistics, juggled not just buses and sound systems, but a minefield of internal politics. Rustin was openly gay and had a history of leftist activism, which made him a target for both enemies of the movement and some of its supposed friends. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and King of an affair if King didn't sideline Rustin. That shadow hung over every planning meeting, every phone call. Gender politics simmered just beneath the surface. Women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height had built the infrastructure of the movement. Yet when it came time for speeches, their roles were relegated to the background. Rosa Parks, revered as an icon, was present, but not given a chance to address the crowd. Even as they demanded equality from the nation, the movement's leaders struggled with their own blind spots and hierarchies. Discord was never far away. Within the Big Six civil rights organizations, friction simmered. The younger activists in SNCC, like Lewis and his peers, grew restless with the older generation's insistence on moderation and patience. They wanted direct confrontation with systemic racism and were increasingly frustrated by calls to wait. CORE, another key group, felt similar impatience. But for just that one day, the imperative of unity was stronger than any disagreement. Everyone agreed that the eyes of the world were upon them. And let's not forget the ever-watchful government. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, assigned more than 100 agents to monitor the march. They bugged hotel rooms, trailed key organizers, and compiled files as thick as dictionaries, convinced the march would erupt in violence or that communist agitators would seize control. The government braced for disaster. When the day passed peacefully, Hoover doubled down on his surveillance, particularly zeroing in on King. Money was another headache. Pulling off a demonstration of this scale cost over $250,000, a sum that, in today's currency, would rival a blockbuster movie budget. Most of it was scraped together from unions and sympathetic donors, but the organizers were scrambling until the last possible moment. They borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts, begged for extra chairs, and at one point considered holding a bake sale. Okay, maybe not that last one, but you get the idea. The March on Washington was monumental, yes, but also deeply achingly human, full of flaws, friction, last-minute fixes, and half-buried squabbles. In other words, it was as complicated and unfinished as the country it aimed to heal. As the sun finally dipped behind the Washington Monument, the crowd began to disperse. Some lingered, reluctant to leave what felt like consecrated ground. Strangers embraced, tears streaked dusty faces, and songs rose one last time above the monuments. It was over. The speeches delivered, the banners waved, the world changed in ways no one could yet measure. But as the last echoes of applause faded into the warm August night, a question hung in the air, heavy as the day's heat. What happens next? And that's where we'll pick up the story. In the immediate days that followed the March on Washington, the media tiptoed in with a cautious sort of applause. Imagine the front pages of 1963. Plenty of black and white photos, a few raised eyebrows, and headlines that praised the march for being minus, get this, orderly and dignified. In translation, that meant no one flipped over a car and the National Mall survived. But while the press admired the spectacle and the scale, most reporters barely touched the real heart of the protest. The detailed demands, like a federal jobs program or a true living wage, which in today's dollars would make your current minimum wage look like lunch money, were mostly buried in the back pages. But one thing no editor could sideline was Dr. King's speech. That thunderous, ringing call for justice was simply impossible to ignore. Behind the scenes, President John F. Kennedy, who had originally been about as enthusiastic about the march as a medieval peasant, was about sharing a bed with lice, watched it unfold live on television. He went from wary to genuinely impressed, even a little startled by the sheer magnitude and discipline of the crowd. Kennedy called it impressive, and within hours, civil rights leaders found themselves whisked into the Oval Office for a sit-down. Yet despite all the high fives and hopeful headlines, the gears of government turned as slowly as a medieval windmill on a windless day. Kennedy's civil rights bill was still jammed in Congress, with Southern lawmakers digging in their heels. The applause faded, and activists found themselves back at square one, organizing, protesting, and mourning the growing list of martyrs who paid the price for justice. The brutal reality of the struggle slammed home with sickening force just weeks later. On September 15, 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was bombed, killing 4 black girls as they prepared for Sunday service. The dream had been spoken to the world, but the nightmare was far from over. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The March on Washington marked a new era. It proved that protest could be peaceful, immense, and impossible for even the most skeptical politician to ignore. For the first time, labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working-class families found themselves united in one place, shoulder to shoulder, demanding justice. And most importantly, the march gave the civil rights movement a voice that would echo not just through newsreels and documentaries, but through the very language of protest for generations. Dr. King's words weren't just sound bites. They were a blueprint, a rallying cry, and a challenge all at once. The march may have ended, but the road ahead was only beginning, winding through heartbreak, hope, and transformation. In the months that followed, the shockwaves of the march didn't just rattle the conscience of America. They reshaped the nation's moral landscape. What began as a bold, maybe even desperate act of protest had become a cornerstone of American history, forever changing the way this country understood justice, democracy, and the raw power of collective action. No, there wasn't an immediate legislative victory. The ink on Kennedy's bill still dried in limbo. But something had changed in the national mood. Less than a year after the march, President Lyndon B. Johnson, never one to miss a historical moment, signed the Civil Rights Act into law in July 1964. Suddenly, segregation in public places was illegal. Discrimination at work based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin became a federal offense. And just a year later, the Voting Rights Act struck at the very heart of Jim Crow. Would Congress have passed these sweeping laws without the march? Maybe. But would they have carried that same moral force? That sense that history itself was watching? That's a much tougher question. The march didn't just pressure lawmakers. It set the agenda and made it impossible to look away. For Martin Luther King Jr., that summer day on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial marked a turning point. The world watched as he transformed from a respected leader into a global symbol of hope and resistance. But with the spotlight came a shadow, intense scrutiny, threats, and round-the-clock surveillance. King's fame became both a shield and a target, leading eventually to his assassination in 1968. The words he spoke that day gained even more weight over time. Sometimes bittersweet, sometimes painful, always powerful. But the real story isn't just about one man or one speech. The March on Washington showed what unity could do. Organizers had discovered a playbook for mass mobilization, one that would inspire not only American activists, but also movements around the globe. South African anti-apartheid organizers, European student rebels, and human rights champions everywhere would point to that summer in Washington as proof that peaceful protest could shake the foundations of power. And yet, the legacy of the march isn't locked away in history books or marble monuments. The language, the imagery, the very idea of jobs and freedom, these are still alive and kicking in today's protests. Every time a new generation takes to the streets, whether for the Million Man March or Black Lives Matter rallies, you can hear the echoes of 1963. Each chant, each cardboard sign, each march through the Capitol, these are all part of the same ongoing chorus. Today, you can stand across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial and look up at Dr. King's statue, his likeness carved in stone, his words etched into the granite. It's a powerful sight, but honestly the real memorial isn't stone at all. It's in the classrooms where students read his speech. It's in the polling stations where every vote is cast in defiance of efforts to suppress it. It's in the marches, the rallies, and the countless voices refusing to be silenced, because the dream wasn't crafted for museums or textbooks alone. It was meant to be argued, lived, and, if necessary, fought for all over again. More than 60 years have slipped by since that August day when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder beneath Abraham Lincoln's massive silent gaze. The March on Washington has become a chapter in every American history textbook, a staple of documentaries, the subject of endless museum exhibits. Dr. King's voice, steady and unwavering, echoes through our collective memory like a sacred refrain. But even now, the question lingers: was the dream realized or merely postponed? There's no denying that progress has been made. The legal scaffolding of segregation was dismantled. Voting rights, though now facing fresh attacks in several states, were hard-won through blood, sweat and tears. The sight of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and yes, even a two-term president would have been unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once a legal impossibility, is now protected by federal law. These victories are real, and they were carved out of history by relentless effort and unimaginable courage. But let's be honest, the original demands of the march, the ones that didn't make the evening news, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage remains unmet. Racial gaps in education, housing, jobs and healthcare are still deeply entrenched. Police violence, the very spark that ignited so much of the early movement, continues to haunt headlines and fuel new waves of protest. The dream of true economic justice, a nation where your zip code or skin color doesn't determine your future, is still a work in progress, if not a distant hope. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have picked up the torch. They march through the same cities, chant down the same boulevards, and demand the same basic rights, now amplified through hashtags, live streams, and viral videos. The world has changed, but the core struggle remains. The March on Washington was never meant to be the final chapter. It was a bold marker, a declaration carved into national memory. This is who we are, and this is what we demand. It was never a neat conclusion. It was a challenge. So the dream endures, sometimes battered, sometimes twisted, sometimes reignited. Whether it will be deferred again, distorted by new injustices, or one day fully realized, doesn't depend on the ghosts of the past. It depends on us, on the choices we make, on the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march forward, time and time again, until the dream is not just remembered, but lived. Now I'll toss the question back to you, dear viewers. Does the echo of that dream still ring in your world? Or is it fading into silence? History isn't just a parade of dates and stone statues. It's the unfinished business of ordinary people, waking up, sometimes even after a rough night's sleep on a lumpy mattress, to demand something better. So, the real legacy of that day in 1963 isn't just in what was achieved, but in what remains for us to do. Will we be content to admire the dream from a safe distance? Or will we step out onto the road, uncomfortable shoes and all, and march until it becomes reality?